We're going to go to Joe Tamburino once again. Joe, what do you think the sentencing will look like for these defendants?
Well, Esme is correct. Under the law, since death was a result of all of this activity, everything that they were found guilty of, you could get up to life in prison. Now, practically, Mr. Chauvin is getting between 20 and 24 years. He's the main actor. Obviously, we know that. So it would be highly unlikely that the judge would sentence these three to something along 20 to 24 years like Mr. Chauvin. So we would expect less than that. But technically, they could get the same as Mr. Chauvin.
Joe, I have a question. You know, obviously, we have a state trial coming up. In past cases, it seemed to me that the criminal trial would go first, and then they would have the civil trial, the federal trial after. How is this going to impact, this federal trial, going to impact the criminal trial, the state trial?
Well, two things. They could still have the trial, obviously, because there are separate charges. But second, practically, you would think some type of a deal would be worked out. Take a look at Mr. Chauvin. He was convicted in state court and then worked out a plea bargain in federal court. We would imagine that something along those lines could happen here, because to do two separate trials involving the same incident would be a little unique. So now that we have a conviction, and I would assume they'd be sentenced within the next few months, that somehow the state trial would be worked out.
And Joe, you know, Esme couldn't see it, but are we assuming the three gentlemen we're looking at and the 5 guilty charges, are they in federal custody right now? I mean, that's usually what happens, right? You get found guilty and they take you away.
That is correct. The only time that doesn't happen is if it's a low-level felony. If it's some type of felony where the guidelines basically would call for a very low amount of jail, say less than 5 years. But in a case like this where you have 3 convictions and so quickly, yes, I would imagine all 3 are in custody right now.
Just got messaged by Esme. It says they were not taken into custody, Joe. So that's different, right?
Interesting. That is different. That's very interesting. So I would imagine they're still going to be on their bond or personal bond.
What? I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask you about, just going back to the wording, because you had talked about it a little bit, that it was unusual that willfully, that word, it was an unusual charge or terminology.
That's correct. In this type of a case where you have criminal civil rights violations against former police officers, the standard is willfully, which is like specific intent. Think of it this way. You have states of mind such as negligence, which is when someone doesn't use proper care. Then you have intentionally, where someone intentionally does something. But then above that, you have specific intent. That means willfully, that you intended to effect something by your actions. It's a high standard. And that's one of the surprising things about this case, that within 14 hours, 39 pages, and all these weeks of trial, they decided pretty solidly.
So these defense arguments, then, I mean, they just didn't, they really didn't resonate with these 12 jurors. All the other video they saw, the training, the concept of the hierarchy of rank inside the police department, I mean, that didn't have a lot of meaning for them, obviously.
Obviously, it didn't. And specifically, Frank, you mentioned the training. There's even a specific instruction from the judge. It's later on in the 39 pages of the jury instructions that talks about how you can use training. And it specifically says that an officer might not follow training, but that doesn't mean he's guilty of violating constitutional law. So the jury in this case had to have been convinced that they went so far afield of training and did willfully intend to do their actions. So it's a solid verdict for the government.
Just got messaged by Esme. It says they were not taken into custody, Joe. So that's different, right?
Interesting. That is different. That's very interesting. So I would imagine they're still going to be on their bond or personal bond.
Right.
I'm just a black man with cameras.